Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, if you've been around the channel for very long, you may have heard me mention that my senior thesis was on Jack the Ripper. And so I've had a long-term interest in that topic and in true crime as a genre for a long time. And so we've done some videos about Jack the Ripper here and there. I actually took a Jack the Ripper tour my first time in London, which was really fascinating. But I will put a link down in the description to my look at Lamino's series. Well, actually, I guess it was really one big video, and I did a whole series out of it on Jack the Ripper, which I think has been one of the definitive treatments of that topic, one of the best ever. And I don't do reactions to Lamino anymore, but that one is definitely one of my favorites that I've ever done. So if you want to check that out for a real deep dive into the topic, I'll put the link in the description. But today, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the channel History Buffs. We've done some videos from them in the past. And I shied away from it for a long time because I felt like History Buffs is already kind of a reaction video because they're reacting to a TV show, but they're going deeper into these topics. And so we're going to take a look at the movie From Hell, which is a heavily fictionalized version of the Jack the Ripper story that I've never really been a huge fan of, but we haven't gotten many good big Hollywood versions of the Jack the Ripper story, so I'm at least thankful that they did that. So the link is in the description to History Buff's original content if you want to check it out. Let's go ahead and dive into this topic. Yeah, that's a fair warning. Also, YouTube, please don't demonetize. Listen, this makes a great point. I mean, it's been a real problem lately, and there doesn't seem to be any easy solution. I had a video demonetized recently because during an entire 30-minute video, for 2 seconds, down in one little corner of the screen, there was a tiny picture of a swastika. And I went through 3 human reviews who all confirmed that I had posted hateful and derogatory content because of that little flag in the little corner of a thing. Anytime you post about certain topics, you risk that, and that's really unfortunate.
Hello and welcome, History Buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and in this episode, I'll be reviewing the historical horror movie From Hell. Based on the graphic novel by the legendary Alan Moore, From Hell tells the tale of the most famous serial killer in history, Jack the Ripper. Everyone knows his name and the horrific legacy left behind in Whitechapel. For over 100 years, his story's been told and retold time and time again, from newspapers to books to TV and to film.
And these are all reasons why he has become so popular, because if you think about it, and it's horrible that we're even making these kinds of comparisons, but in the grand scheme, interesting, of serial killers, not that significant. Killed probably 5 people. There's debate about that, and I'm sure we'll get into that topic about how many victims there were. But it's about the time and place and the way in which it got magnified because of the media coverage, and continues to be magnified because of continued media coverage, and because of the fact that we never found out for sure who it was, which has all made this such a big deal.
All tirelessly analysing and cross-examining every detail, trying to make sense of the madness during the Autumn of Terror. This 2001 film joins the fray, but despite its fascinating subject matter, its contribution to the legend is poorly executed. Over the course of this review, I'll be going over the real history behind Jack the Ripper, as well as point out the movie's biggest flaws and inaccuracies. This is From Hell.
The Canonical Five.
It's 3:45 in the morning. The slums of London's East End that burst with life during the day hang with an eerie stillness. Whenever interrupted, its empty streets magnify faint noises in the distance, whether it be lone footsteps in cobbled streets or the occasional dog barking. In Bucks Row, new sounds break the silence. A cart driver called Charles Cross approaches. On his way to work, he notices the body of a woman lying before a gate. Another man called Robert Paul passes by and spots this as well. Together they rush over and see a middle-aged woman lying dead with her throat slit and a deep gash in her lower abdomen. The two frightened men leave her side to fetch a policeman.
So the strange thing about this initial victim is that they didn't initially know how badly she'd been mutilated. It was only later on during the investigation they figured this out. Initially, they just found a woman who they thought her throat had been slit. And unfortunately, this was an all too common occurrence in Whitechapel. Whitechapel is a very poor area just east of the center of London. If you're familiar with London at all, or if you look at a map, you know where Tower Bridge and the Tower of London is. Whitechapel is right next to that. That's kind of the area of London that we're dealing with. And this is where a lot of immigrants were coming. London has grown significantly during the 19th century. It's become the most populous city on the planet. A lot of immigration is happening, a lot of very poor people, and a lot of women, especially the women that we're dealing with this canonical five. These are women who, many of whom had started out in life in a pretty normal way, had been wives, several of them are mothers, but unfortunately, many of them dealt with alcohol abuse issues and had found themselves going into the streets. And for women, there weren't a lot of options as far as how you made money. And so many of them turned to prostitution to feed their alcohol habit, but also just to get by every day. And people didn't know from one day to the next where they were even going to be staying. So a lot of these women were just trying to make money enough to be able to pay for a room for that night.
Not wanting to make a scene, the police removed the corpse as quickly as possible. Only a few hours remained before the locals woke up for work.
Yeah.
By the time they did, her blood and any possible evidence left behind was gone.
And this is a great point he makes here, because one of the things that really hinders the Jack the Ripper investigation is that priorities were not on preserving the crime scene, collecting evidence, and those sorts of things. The priorities were on, how do we keep this from becoming a problem? How do we keep this from spreading and causing hysteria and panic and riots? Because this was a common thing, and because you have these vigilance committees, these groups of vigilante citizens who would take it upon themselves to go deal with the problem, which in many cases was the immigration population.
At the mortuary, the extent of the lady's mutilations were clear.
Yeah.
The two deep cuts in her neck reached all the way to her spine, and she had also been disemboweled. In their examination, the doctors concluded that the inflicted wounds were not frantically made. The cuts were too precise, leaving them to theorize that they could only have been made by a man experienced in dissection. When the story of the murder reached the newspapers, it brought a lot of attention. The victim's identity was eventually revealed to be a local prostitute called Mary Ann Nichols. Normally, the murder of a prostitute in Whitechapel might have only been regarded as a local story. After all, it was well known for being a dodgy place, and violence against prostitutes was not uncommon. But this murder was something very different, unprecedented. The excessive mutilations turned the stomachs of Victorian Londoners, but they had no idea that more was on its way. In the late 19th century, London was the industrial heart of the British Empire. Yeah. Its power and influence felt the world over.
So you saw their image of St. Paul's Cathedral, and that's actually really close to this area too.
But it was a capital city hardly worthy of the name. Its skies were choked with thick smog, pumped into the air round the clock by coal smoke leaving factories and chimneys.
If you want to see a really good portrayal of this time and place in history, watch the TV show Ripper Street. Fantastic. One of my all-time favorite shows.
Gap between the haves and have-nots was immense, as millions of the urban poor lived in overcrowded slums and ghettos, often with entire families living in one room.
Yeah.
Life's prospects in finding work was difficult, especially for unmarried women, turning many to drink and prostitution.
And as I said, some of these women had been married, and their husbands had thrown them out because of their alcohol abuse, or they'd gotten divorced, or things like that happened. And it was really unfortunate that was the reality. These women didn't turn to prostitution because they wanted to. It's because in many cases they felt like they had no other place to go.
Often whatever was earned was used to simply pay for room and board for a night.
Yep.
Out of London society.
They would call it DOS money. It was like their money to pay for a room for that night. And a lot of times you even have situations where guys would go in and women too. And there'd be these rooms, and you'd have 40 people sleeping in the room. There wasn't even enough room to lay down to sleep, and so they'd have ropes tied across the room, and people would actually lay across the rope and sleep that way.
They were the most shunned and the most vulnerable. With this grim side of London life now in the spotlight, it was quite frankly an embarrassment to the elite. Eager to conclude this investigation as quickly as possible, Scotland Yard assigned Frederick Aberline, one of their top inspectors, to the case. Having served in Whitechapel years before, his local knowledge and already established presence in the community were vital assets. For now, the newspapers were content with spinning their own theories, mainly passing it off as a potential gangland slaying. For the next week, the investigation continued, but found nothing new. That was until the body of another prostitute was discovered. On Saturday, the 8th of September at 6 a.m., Annie Chapman was found in a backyard in Hanbury Street. As with Mary Ann Nichols, her throat had been severed by 2 severe cuts, and she had also been disemboweled. But Chapman's mutilated remains were more excessive than Mary Ann Nichols. Her intestines had been removed and placed on her shoulder, and a uterus was missing. But despite the increased ferocity, the surgical precision in the cuts remained the same.
So this is actually, it's literally in a backyard. So it's fenced off. It's not out on the street. And so while we don't know how long this took, he had some privacy in this case. They would have had to go through the doors of the building into the backyard. And so one of the incredible things about this whole story is how very little in the way of eyewitness testimony exists, because other than what we call the double event, which he'll get to next, there aren't a lot of people who actually claim to see the guy that they believe was responsible for this. And you have police that are patrolling, but they're on very set timetables. And so if you knew the police routes, you could kind of time yourself and know how much time you had in between when the police would come along.
The careful removal of the organs also showed the killer's knowledge of anatomy, supporting the same theory as before. This new lead directed the police to investigate doctors, medical students, and butchers. When the second murder was announced to the public, all claims of it being gangland killings were silenced. The cruelty behind the attacks just didn't add up. Panic began to grip the East End, with people looking for someone to blame by lashing out in all the wrong places.
So we live in a time now today where we have things like the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which if you want to check it out on Netflix, they have Mindhunter, which is phenomenal. And it's such a crime, to use that word, that we didn't get more seasons of that show. It's so good. So good. But now we understand that there's a psychology behind this and that everything means something. But back then it was just like this horrific thing that got sensationalized in the newspapers. People didn't understand it, and so it scared them, and they were fascinated. And then, of course, you get the name Jack the Ripper that gets associated with it.
A local man called George Lusk founded a group named the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee,
Yep.
and it took to the streets in search for the killer. It started by targeting the neighborhood's large Jewish communities. One piece of evidence the newspapers sensationalized was a leather apron found at the crime scene. This convinced many that it belonged to a Polish Jew called John Pizer, who was commonly known as Leather Apron. He had a history of violence, including minor assaults and prostitutes. Pizer was arrested and questioned, but later released due to his cleared alibis. However, this did little to assure the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee or alleviate their anti-Semitism.
Huge component to this, and that's going to come back to bite the police later when you get a real piece of evidence that might have helped nail down who the killer was, that they very quickly get rid of because it might have incited the people even more against the Jewish population.
Happy with the lack of police progress and protection, George Lusk put together a group of volunteers from the community to patrol the streets at night. Combined with the police presence, this joint effort seems to be working. Over 3 weeks went by without further attacks or much else pertaining to the investigation. The frenzied media circus surrounding it inspired hundreds of frauds to send in fake letters claiming to be the killer. Many were disregarded outright, except for one that was delivered to the Central News Agency on the 27th of September.
The Dear Boss
written
letter.
in red ink, it read, Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed and they look so clever and talked about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send it to the police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. It was the Dear Boss letter that gave us the name we all know today.
Yep.
It very nearly got disqualified with the other fake letters, but something about it intrigued the journalists. After much debating, they decided to forward the letter to Scotland Yard on the 29th of September. As expected, they were skeptical about it as well.
It's almost certainly a forgery, probably written by some enterprising newsman who wanted to sell papers. Jack the Ripper definitely did not give himself that name.
Nothing much added to the letter's legitimacy. That was until the following night. After 22 days of peace, Jack was back. Around 12:45 a.m. on Sunday, September 30th, a Hungarian Jew called Israel Schwartz was walking down Berner Street when he thought he saw a young couple having an argument by Dutfield Yard. Quickly turning violent, the man threw the screaming woman onto the pathway. Not wanting to get involved, Schwartz crossed the road, passing by a second man standing nearby watching him.
You might watch this and think, why would he do that? But remember, Whitechapel, time and place. This, unfortunately, was a very common thing, hearing women scream, even hearing screams of murder, which you're going to have with the fifth victim. So people, think about how often you've walked by scenes that you were just like, I don't want to really be involved. I want to avoid that situation.
First man stopped what he was doing and cried out to the second, Lipski, a derogative name for a Jew. The second man began following Schwartz, causing him to panic and run. Eventually, the man gave up the chase, and Schwartz escaped unharmed. His eyewitness testimony was considered one of the most crucial in the entire investigation. Not only did he see an actual attack in progress, but it opened the possibility there might be two men committing them instead of one. At 1 o'clock, a pony driver called Louis D.M. Schutz approached Dutfield's yard when he saw the body of a woman in the pathway. She was identified as the prostitute Elizabeth Stride, later confirmed by Schwartz as the very same woman he saw being attacked. Supported by the fact that, unlike the previous victims, Stride's corpse had no mutilations. Her throat had been slit the same as the others, but that's about it, meaning that Schwartz had disturbed the killer before he had time to finish, forcing the Ripper's hand to strike again that very night.
Yeah, and that's the theory that we're dealing with here, is that he, understanding the psychology of who this murderer may have been, that he didn't get to do what he normally would do to one of these victims, and so he went unsatisfied. And so he had to go find another victim, and so he goes this time over to Mitre Square, and this is where he finds Catherine Eddowes.
Just 15 minutes away from Berner Street, another body was discovered on Mitre Street, belonging to Catherine Eddowes. There had been no interruption this time, her face lacerated almost beyond recognition.
And this is the only one of the 5 victims' murder sites that still really exists. If you go, you might find yourself a little disappointed if you take a Jack the Ripper tour. Because, for example, where Mary Jane Kelly was murdered, who's the 5th victim, it's a shopping, like kind of business shopping area now. None of these places, either because they were torn down, the slums, and rebuilt into bigger, more expensive buildings, or from the bombing during the Blitz in World War II. But Mitre Square, you can go to the exact spot where they found Catherine Eddowes' body, and actually I posted a picture of me on Instagram in that exact spot.
Her abdomen grotesquely disemboweled, and half her kidney was missing. As the police found out...
Remember that part about the kidney, because this is where From Hell is going to get brought into this.
Searching the nearby areas, they found a piece of a blood-stained apron lying on the floor on Galston Street. This would later be confirmed as Catherine Eddowes. Above the apron piece was a message written in chalk on the wall. It read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." At 5 a.m., Commissioner Warren came personally to look at it and was faced with a dilemma. Aside from the apron piece, there was nothing about the message itself that indicated that it was by the Ripper. It's likely that it was just anti-Semitic graffiti and had been written a while ago. If, however, it was written by Jack, its sinister purpose was obviously to drive suspicion onto the Jewish community. To avoid civil unrest, Commissioner Warren ordered it to be washed off,
without taking a picture of it. And that site, that doorway where that happened, that does still exist as well. We actually went to that exact spot where that message was written.
When the results from the post-mortem examination came in, the police re-examined the Dear Boss letter. What interested them was the sentence, "The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off," and Catherine Eddowes' earlobe had been sliced, but both ears remained. It could have just been a coincidence, but on the 1st of October, Scotland Yard received a postcard, also allegedly from the killer, reading, "I was not coddling dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You hear about Saucy Jack's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number one squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not got time to get ears off for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I get to work again."
And that's why they call that the double event. It's from this letter.
Jack the Ripper. The writer's knowledge of the murders was intriguing, as the postcard was written before they were even published in the newspapers. But although the public didn't know about it, the police didn't rule out that both the Dear Boss letter and the postcard could have been hoaxes written by an ambitious journalist. However, even this level-headed theory would be challenged, as another letter was sent, this time accompanied by a package. They had both been sent to George Lusk on the 16th of October.
And this is the one that, if any of these are real, it's the From Hell letter. This is most likely to be real out of all of these.
Letter read, "From Hell. Mr. Lusk, sir, I sent you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if you'll only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can, Mr. Lusk."
No, notice it wasn't signed Jack the Ripper, because the killer didn't give himself that name. And so if this is the killer, it makes sense he didn't sign it Jack the Ripper. If somebody was forging, they probably would have been more likely to use that term now that it had become popular. There's also a lot of misspellings in it, and it's very likely that Jack the Ripper was probably an immigrant, specifically a Polish Jew with the name Kaminsky, but not Aaron Kaminsky, who was a specific suspect.
The package included half a woman's kidney, and it matched Catherine Eddowes' missing half. Needless to say, this letter and its package was treated very seriously by Scotland Yard. But they noticed that its handwriting, poor grammar and spelling, was considerably worse to the previous letter and postcard.
Why? Because the ones that were well written, probably by journalists who were much better educated and spoke English as a first language, whereas it might not have been the case with the From Hell letter.
Appearing to be written by different people, and maybe that's the point.
Yep.
If Jack the Ripper really was a doctor or a surgeon, then he would have been an educated man, which is what the police were looking for. So to throw off the scent, he sends them poorly written letters, with just enough information validating them, which kind of makes sense why each one gets progressively worse, as if they're overcompensating, but that's just my opinion.
Nah, I disagree with him completely on that. The other letters are written by a completely different person. This is not a doctor trying to throw off the scent, because if that was what he was concerned about, he never would have written the letters in the first place.
At this point in the investigation, public confidence in the Metropolitan Police and Scotland Yard was an all-time low. Every day the papers published another article mocking their efforts.
And so put yourself in the position, and you're actually dealing with different police forces, because you have the Metropolitan Police, which deal with crimes in the metro area, because Whitechapel is actually not part of the City of London. The City of London is like this really small area right at the very center. And only, I think, the Catherine Eddowes murder, the one in Mitre Square, I think is the only one of the 5 that actually takes place in the City of London. So most of these are being dealt with by the Metropolitan Police.
Labeling them as incompetent, one issue of Punch took the not-so-subtle approach with the cartoon, comparing the investigation to a game of blind man's bluff. For nearly 10 weeks of fruitless efforts, the Commissioner Sir Charles Warren was ridiculed and scrutinised. Fed up with it all, on the 8th of November, he sent in his letter of resignation. Coincidentally, it was right before Jack's final murder. At 10:45 a.m. on Friday the 9th of November, a landlord was making his rounds to collect rent money. One of his properties was a single-bedroom flat in Miller's Court, Dorset Street, and it was currently occupied by a young prostitute called Mary Jane Kelly. When his knocks and calls weren't answered, he peered through the window to see if anyone was home.
And this is a great portrayal of it here. I mean, this is exactly what it looks like, even right down to the broken piece of the window.
He was met with an indescribable sight of appalling horror and gore. It was Jack the Ripper's magnum opus.
There are photographs of this, and I highly recommend you don't look up the photos of Mary Jane Kelly unless you want something that's going to be seared into your brain for the rest of your life. It's legitimately one of the most horrifying things you will ever see. And there's a scene in Ripper Street where the character of Fred Aberline is speaking to Edmund Reed, who is one of the investigators on all of this. And Edmund Reed shows up at Mary Jane Kelly's flat. And Aberline's walking out, and he looks at him and he says, "Edmund, I want to unmake the world." And that really sums up what that experience of seeing that scene must have been like for them.
Previous killings had always been out in public, and the risk of being caught always limited the time he could spend on each victim.
Yep.
But out of sight, in Mary Kelly's flat, he no longer needed to hold himself back. He could give in to his most evil and sickest desires.
So you can see even just the way they portrayed those cops, the one with tears in his eyes, and then Michael Caine's character coming out just stunned. That's exactly what you would expect the reaction to be from people who would have seen that firsthand.
So that is pretty much how the story of Jack the Ripper ends. For 10 weeks he terrorized the people of Whitechapel before disappearing just as suddenly as he arrived. There were, of course, other murders that followed, also targeting prostitutes, but these were believed to be copycats. But Mary Jane Kelly,
or just completely unrelated, because again, I'm not going to pause on that.
is
That's
widely
actually the
believed to
image
be
of
the
Mary
last
Jane Kelly
victim.
there. That's one of the reasons why this whole thing's so complicated, because there were murders of prostitutes before the canonical five. There were murders of prostitutes after the canonical five. And the question is, did he escalate up to what he did to those five? Did he suddenly stop? Because the understanding we have of serial killers now is that they don't typically stop. They might pause, but then you have guys like BTK who sometimes went years without killing anybody. There's no way to really understand one to the next.
Of Jack the Ripper. I should also point out that there were other murders that preceded Mary Ann Nichols that some believe were also carried out by the Ripper, but I chose to focus instead on the canonical five. That was Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly.
And to be honest, there are some people who even disagree that Mary Jane Kelly is a canonical five, that there should really only be canonical four, that some people think that Mary Jane Kelly was killed by an ex-boyfriend or a boyfriend or something, and that the other four were completely separate.
As to the fate of Jack the Ripper, who he was and why he stopped, we will probably never know. His crimes remain unsolved, but not for lack of trying. The Metropolitan Police and Scotland Yard threw all their resources at this case.
They did.
Interviewing 2,000 people, investigating 300 persons, and detaining 80 suspects. All to no avail. But
yeah, the idea that the police were somehow incompetent and didn't do their job, yeah, there were some elements to it, like washing away the sign that was written, or the stuff in chalk that was written the night of the double event without photographing it first. There were certainly some things that got missed, but they worked their tails off trying to lock this guy down.
Could it be possible that out of all of these suspects, one of them was indeed Jack the Ripper, hiding in plain sight, the police never realizing that the face of true evil was staring right back at theirs?
Quite possible.
These eyes will deceive you. They will destroy you. They will take from you your innocence, your pride, and eventually your soul. These eyes do not see what you and I see. Behind these eyes, one finds only blackness, the absence of light. These are the eyes of a psychopath.
For this chapter, I'm going to go over a list of suspects pertaining to the possible identity behind Jack the Ripper. But before I do, I need to explain that there's no way in hell I can cover them all, especially within the time constraints of a brief review. There's literally hundreds of people thought to be the killer, so if I miss your favourite one, please don't hold it against me. Also, if you're considering watching this film, or better yet, reading the graphic novel by Alan Moore, then you might want to do that first before watching the rest of this video, as I'm about to go into some major spoilers.
And I'm about to completely rip to shreds the theory that is proposed in From Hell. There are some very plausible theories about who Jack the Ripper was. The one behind the From Hell story, which does have its roots in that time period, not a chance.
For the rest of you, I'm guessing that either you've seen it or you're not really bothered by it, and you just want to learn some history. In which case, let's get started. The entire basis behind From Hell's plot hinges on this elaborate conspiracy theory involving the Freemasons, that they were responsible for the Whitechapel murders. For any of you who don't know, the Freemasons are a centuries-old secret society that boasts some of history's most influential figures, such as Winston Churchill, the Duke of Wellington, Voltaire, Mozart, and George Washington.
Yep.
Because of members like these, some people think that the Freemasons are pulling strings behind the scenes and running the world. In the movie From Hell, the Whitechapel murders are sanctioned by the Freemasons to cover up a royal scandal involving Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria.
So if you're not familiar with Albert Victor, he is the eldest son of the future Edward VII. He's the older brother of the future George V. And the only reason George V comes to the throne is because his older brother Albert Victor ends up dying fairly young. And he was involved in a couple of scandals. There was one involving a homosexual scandal, and then, of course, the Jack the Ripper thing. But he had an alibi, which, of course, they don't show him as being the killer in From Hell. It's just done on his behalf.
Prince Edward married Anne Crook, a commoner and a Catholic. Married her in a Catholic church. They had a baby, a legitimate baby, who is in fact heir to the throne of England. All these women were there. All these women were eyewitnesses to an event that could rip the empire to pieces.
Committing these murders is the Queen's physician, Sir William Gull, and instead of taking care of it quietly, he goes way beyond the call of duty by mutilating the bodies. Apparently they're supposed to be in accordance with the physical penalties of Masonic rituals and oaths.
We asked Sir William to remove a threat to our family and to our throne, not to engage in these ghastly rituals.
So you got Queen Victoria in on it at this point, too.
Oh, no, of course not, Your Majesty. That was unexpected.
Now, obviously, this theory is ridiculous, but its potential as a good story was too good to pass up by the creative industry, which is why it was adapted by both the graphic novel and the movie, as well as a 1988 miniseries called Jack the Ripper.
And this all goes back to something we've talked about before in connection with things like the Kennedy assassination, is that whenever these significant events like this happen and then they're not definitively solved, or there's questions about those things, people tend to gravitate toward the idea that there's some grand conspiracy rather than the simplest and most plausible solution, which is that one person took it upon themselves to do this. It's why people have such a hard time accepting that Lee Harvey Oswald killed John F. Kennedy. They want it to be some grand conspiracy, not some random dude who was in his early 20s who just decided to kill the president. And the same is true here. We don't want to believe that one person did this and got away with it and captured worldwide attention, so it's more sexy to believe there was some grand royal conspiracy behind it.
But once you look at the evidence, its plausibility falls apart. First introduced in a book published in 1976 called Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, where its author Stephen Knight presented the royal family and Freemason connection, as well as state that the English painter Walter Sickert was an accomplice of Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that are claiming the Sickert thing, and anytime you hear somebody come out and say, I've got the answer, everybody else missed it, but here's the answer, they're full of it. They're full of it, and they're trying to sell a book, they're trying to sell a movie, they're trying to sell something to you. There's nobody that has the answer.
His main source for this information was Joseph Gorman, who claimed to be Walter Sickert's illegitimate son. However, after the book's successful publication, Stephen Knight's source admitted that he had made the whole thing up, so now both the book and the theory are widely discredited by the academic community. But even if this hadn't happened, I still wouldn't believe it.
No.
Why would the Queen ask her family physician, who was in his 70s at the time, and had recently suffered a stroke, to kill 5 prostitutes? Wouldn't it be easier just to have them arrested and make them disappear? It's just stupid because it tries to rationalize the killings of a psychopath.
Yep.
Some people find it easier to accept a convoluted conspiracy than the awful truth.
There you go.
That these women died for no real reason, other than to satisfy a sick, evil man's perversions.
100%.
So that takes care of William Gull and the whole Freemason royal family angle. But who are some other suspects we can consider instead?
And the reason that they're showing him like that is because in the end of the movie they give him a lobotomy and they throw him in prison.
Well, Frederick Aberline's favourite suspect was Severin Klostowski, a Polish barber living in Whitechapel who had previously had a career in Poland as a surgeon before emigrating to London sometime after 1887. He was eventually convicted of murdering 3 of his wives and hanged in 1903. But unlike Jack the Ripper, he used poison, so it doesn't really match his MO. Another suspect was stage actor Richard Mansfield. While the murders were going on, he was performing in the play The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And his transformation into Mr. Hyde was so effective that it convinced terrified audience members that he must have been the Ripper.
There you go. And this is how this works, especially when it's been sensationalized by the media. Look at what happens today. Somebody says something or they latch onto something and mass hysteria ensues and everybody repeats it. And so people are freaking out because there's a killer on the loose and nobody can find him. And oh my gosh, look at how convincingly this guy can go from normal to scary killer. Maybe he's doing it in real life.
Mansfield was of course questioned by the police, but no evidence could be found to implicate him. Unfortunately, this accusation did serious damage to Mansfield's acting career, despite his innocence. Walter Sickert is another potential suspect who has popped up more recently. As I said earlier, Walter Sickert was an English artist, and the man was obsessed with Jack the Ripper. It is most obvious with some of his paintings that are heavily inspired from the murders. In fact, there is one scene in the movie that pays homage to his painting, The Camden Town Murder. Patricia Cornwell, a contemporary American crime writer, was convinced that Sickert was the Ripper, writing about it in her book, Portrait of a Killer, Jack the Ripper, Case Closed.
Anytime you say case closed, it's not.
And reportedly spent several £1 million during her investigation. However, her findings weren't enough to convince the academic community. There was also an Irish-American called Francis Tumblety, who is considered to be the Ripper. He was a snake oil salesman who frequently visited Europe and had earned a reputation as a troublemaker with the law. Although nothing too serious, just various acts of thievery and misdemeanors, but he did keep getting the attention from the authorities for more serious crimes.
And while we're talking about Americans, can we just go ahead and stop this nonsense about it being H.H. Holmes? It wasn't. The evidence isn't there.
For example, in 1865, he was arrested under suspicion for his involvement for Abraham Lincoln's assassination, which he was innocent of and let go. Francis Tumblety came across the Metropolitan Police's radar when they arrested him on November 7, 1888 for homosexual offences. After paying his bail, he fled the country, and this didn't look really good to the police who were already looking into him as a suspect.
And yeah, the fact that the murders suddenly stop right after he leaves the country.
Especially as the murders stopped right after he left. But by focusing on this American, another went by completely unnoticed, an actual serial killer called H.H. Holmes. He has become quite a popular suspect in recent years.
No chance.
His arrival and departure in England matches within the murder's time frame, as well as his physical.
That is not... There's speculation about his arrival and departure in the UK. What they did was they found a name that they think was a pseudonym that he sometimes used. There's no solid evidence he was even in the country when this stuff happened. And his MO for the murders he committed later in Chicago, completely different. I'm so tired of that theory. No chance. And this Jack the Ripper composite image from the descriptions fit about half the guys of that time period.
Physical description with eyewitness testimonies. He was also a practicing surgeon, making him an ideal candidate to being Jack the Ripper. The strongest argument for it is that back in his home Chicago, he was confirmed to have killed up to 9 people. His method of doing so was horrifying. Holmes had built a hotel specifically designed to kill human beings. A tenant would struggle to make it out alive, from the maze-like corridors, secret rooms, doors that opened to nothing but brick walls. Any screams for help would be muffled by walls lined with asbestos and a steel vault to suffocate or starve out his victims. That's what they would experience if they escaped from their bedrooms.
That's not the way that the Jack the Ripper killer would have done things.
But Holmes had also engineered death traps in them as well. While his tenants slept, hidden gas lines would pump in poison gas. After they died, he would take their bodies to the basement, where a furnace awaited. Truly a terrifying individual.
But 100% not Jack the Ripper.
But Ripperologists think it's unlikely that he was Jack the Ripper.
He wasn't.
Holmes ultimately killed for profit, whether it was by robbing his victims or selling their organs to medical colleges, whereas Jack killed for pleasure and was much more impulsive,
Right.
only taking select organs, indicating their purpose as trophies rather than to be sold.
And if he was concerned about robbing people, he wouldn't have chosen prostitutes who had next to nothing.
Now, whilst I don't think that H.H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper, the possibility is still intriguing, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing the upcoming movie made about him. Called Devil in the White City, it's set to star Leonardo DiCaprio as Holmes and be directed by Martin Scorsese. For this final chapter, I'm going to go over some of the numerous inaccuracies made in the film, and
It's a little disappointing to me that he covered some of the more sensationalist suspects, but not the ones that are legit. And that's something that gets covered a lot more in the Lamino series that I did on Jack the Ripper, so I won't dive into all of that now. But none of the people he just mentioned are legit candidates to be Jack the Ripper. You're almost certainly dealing with someone who was a Polish Jew, probably a guy named Kosminski, but not the Aaron Kosminski who is actually on the radar screen of the police.
most likely noticed so far that I haven't spoken that much about it. To be honest, I find it incredibly dull and it still hasn't left much an impression on me. I really just picked From Hell as an excuse to talk about the history of Jack the Ripper, which I do find very interesting. And now I have to talk about how this movie cocks it up. So
I completely understand his agony at having to talk about how the movie portrayed this. Please, 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 if you watch the movie, watch it for entertainment. Don't watch it if you're interested in learning more about the Jack the Ripper killings, because this ain't it.
where do I start? I guess we could literally go to the very beginning with a direct quote by Jack the Ripper. One day men will look back and say, I gave birth to the 20th century. It's referenced again later in the movie by Jack himself.
It's not a quote from Jack the Ripper, though. It's a quote from somebody claiming to be the killer.
One day, men will look back and say I gave birth to the 20th century.
It's a cool line, but it doesn't come from Jack the Ripper, and it isn't written on any of his alleged letters. The quote is actually from the graphic novel, and this wouldn't necessarily bother me if they only had the character Jack say it, but having it written like this makes it look deceptively authentic.
Yeah.
Here, I'll show you. But what's going to frustrate history buffs the most are the terribly written characters. Frederick Abberline, played by Johnny Depp, is the worst offender. In the movie, he's a genius detective who also happens to be a psychic, and his visions allow him to see the future and the murders
And a drug addict.
he's investigating. Maybe. Because he's also like an opium addict, and these may just be hallucinations, since the
And the opium thing, I mean, that is true to the time period. This is when you got the British Empire is at its height, and there's a lot of opium that's being imported into the United Kingdom, and guys were falling victim to that. There's no evidence that Abberline was, though.
shown in a green filter look like the absinthe that we see him drink. It's very confusing because in the movie it also implies that these visions are real. In any case, it should be rather obvious that the filmmakers got a little bit carried away. The real Abberline was middle-aged, fat, balding, a decent detective, but nowhere near the brilliant mind Johnny Depp is portrayed to be. He also didn't have psychic superpowers, and he wasn't an opium addict, which then obviously means he didn't die of an overdose, but lived a long, comfortable life until 1929. And it's not just me who hates
40 years after the Jack the Ripper murders.
this portrayal of Abberline. Here's an interview MTV did with Alan Moore, the author of the graphic novel From Hell. He was an unassuming man in middle age who was not a heavy drinker, and who, as far as I know, remained faithful to his wife throughout his entire life. Johnny Depp saw fit to play this character as an absinthe-swilling, opium den-frequenting dandy with a haircut that, in the Metropolitan Police Force in 1888, would have gotten him beaten up by the other officers.
Even the author of the source material for this movie is ripping how Abberline was portrayed. And listen, I'm not a movie maker, so I don't understand the thought process that goes into these things, but the real story is already so fascinating and so interesting. I don't understand why you have to screw it up like this.
Okay, he said it far better than I ever could. And just for fun, here's a nitpicky question. How does Detective Abberline own a gramophone? The movie takes place in the autumn of 1888. The gramophone was only just revealed to the public for the first time in May 16, 1888, by its inventor, Emil Berliner. So, I highly doubt it had been commercially available yet. Even if it was, a middle-class detective certainly couldn't afford it. Even if he could, what would he listen to?
Yeah, and this is the thing about inventions, is that when you look at when something was invented, don't mistake the date of invention with the date of it being commercially successful. Because there's often a long time period between when something is created and when something is made accessible to the public, because it's been perfected enough that it can be mass produced for a relatively inexpensive amount to where people can afford it. You know, for example, the automobile, invented back, in the 1880s? But it's a couple of decades after that before people start having automobiles in large numbers. Same thing is true for pretty much any invention.
There was no record companies producing music back then. Society hasn't caught up yet to this technological marvel, especially not within 3 bloody months of its reveal. The only music he could potentially listen to was by Emil Berliner himself. Next, I would like to talk about Mary Jane Kelly, portrayed by Heather Graham. Now, normally I think she's a decent actress, but she's terribly miscast here.
Yeah.
The first thing you're going to notice is that she can't pull off a Cockney accent to save her life.
I warned you and your friends. Payment was expected Monday.
I'm working, ain't I? We all are.
It's only the heart and soul of the gang. Isn't it your job to be knowing that small detail?
I used to think it too small to spend a life in, but now I'm not so sure.
And by the way, in this version of the Jack the Ripper story, Mary Jane Kelly doesn't even die. She actually gets away and goes to Ireland, and somebody else dies in her place.
That's bad enough already, but I want to discuss how unconvincing her character's portrayal is from a historical angle. Although the real Mary Kelly was known to be young and beautiful, it still doesn't change the...
Yeah, he makes a good point there that we didn't talk about, which is that most of these other victims, the canonical victims, were like around 40. Mary Jane Kelly's in her mid-20s.
The fact that she was a 19th century prostitute from Whitechapel. But in the film, she's very well groomed, her clothes are clean, her hair beautifully shines like she just came out of a hairdresser. She just stands out when compared to the other prostitutes who are battered, grimy, and disheveled. Far more fitting appearances based on their living conditions. Take, for example, this scene. To the movie's credit, this is very accurate.
Yep.
These girls
There, you see the rope?
are so poor that they have to sleep in a doss house. That's a Victorian homeless shelter, and they're paying for the cheapest service. It was called a penny sit-up. Basically, if you paid a penny, you could sleep in a seated position and lean against a rope tucked beneath your arms.
So he said about a doss house. One of the women, the night that she was killed, had made a comment about going out to get her doss money. That was the money to pay for a doss house for the night.
Some doss houses were so overcrowded that this was the only service they provided. So this clearly shows just how desperate their situation is.
Yep.
Which leads me to my next point. One of the likely reasons they could only afford a penny sit-up was because they spent most of their money on booze.
They did.
Mary Jane Kelly was especially well known for being a drinker.
Several of them were. In fact, that's why some of their lives fell apart, was because of alcohol. And I know some people have covered this, and I've wanted to do it for a while now, and I will at some point. I think we focus so heavily on the killer that we forget that these were 5 human lives that were ended. And I don't think enough focus has been put on telling these women's stories.
But we never see her on-screen counterpart get plastered. She has like these little dainty sips here and there, but nothing to suggest she's an alcoholic. Unlike her friends, where we do get that impression. And I think the reason why is because the filmmakers are so intent on making Heather Graham look pretty that they sacrifice any attempt at authenticity. No matter how beautiful a girl may be, it's not a sexy look if she's completely shit-faced.
I want to go upstairs. There's something I want to show you. Hey, party on!
I should also mention that Detective Aberline didn't have an intimate relationship with Mary Kelly because they never met before her murder. And yes, she was in fact murdered, unlike in the movie where she escapes just in time to run away to Ireland. I also have a problem with the unfair portrayal of Sir Charles Warren. the Metropolitan Police Commissioner overseeing the Whitechapel murders. In From Hell, he's reduced to a one-dimensional, cliched bad guy. There's a scene where Warren and
who actually looks a lot more like the real Aberline than Johnny Depp does,
are debating about who Jack the Ripper might be, and the filmmakers pull every cheap trick in the book to make him look like a prick. For example, he's xenophobic.
Well, one thing's for certain. An Englishman didn't do it.
He's racist.
Maybe one of these Red Indians wandered into Whitechapel and indulged his natural inclinations.
He's a snob.
No well-bred man would do this.
He's an anti-Semite.
What about the Jews?
Well, sir, for the sake of public safety in general, I'd like to be careful about spreading the rumours that it might be a Jew.
Oh, piss off. Nobody was more concerned about the well-being of the Jewish community than the real Charles Warren. That's why he ordered that graffiti washed off.
Was it because he was concerned about the well-being of the Jewish community, or was he concerned about public sentiment and there being riots and fighting and people going after Jews, which meant more work for the police? He might be going a little too far in being generous to Charles Warren here, but I get the point that he's making.
Wash that off.
What?
You heard me.
It's evidence, sir.
Listen to me. In another hour, there will be 1,000 people poking about in here.
So you bring in some police and you block them off from getting in there until you get a picture of it.
Words are seen, not a Jew in London will be safe.
Oh, I thought you didn't care about the Jews. You seemed pretty cool with pointing a finger at them a second ago.
Yeah, that's not inconsistent, though. He could have thought it was probably one of those immigrant Jews that did it, while also thinking, you know what, that doesn't make all of them bad. I don't think the two are incompatible with each other here.
Or a Jew tailor might have money. There are plenty of them in Whitechapel.
Just for the record, no, he's not a diet anti-Semite. He really does it because he's a Freemason and he's using his power and influence to cover up evidence.
There you go.
All you're doing is destroying his value as evidence.
No. All I'm doing is taking charge of an investigation that you have bungled to the point of gross inefficiency. And I've had enough. You are suspended from duty, Aberline.
I should also point out that Charles Warren didn't suspend Aberline during the investigation, nor did he promote him after the last murder.
You are reinstated. Indeed, you are promoted.
It's so frustrating with just how much history is an inconvenience to this film. They go way too far with the creative liberties in order to push this Masonic conspiracy narrative. Whilst it's true that the real Charles Warren was a Freemason, you shouldn't read too much into it.
Yeah.
So was Richard Pryor. As for the idea that the police were compromised...
That's a really random reference there to Richard Pryor. That's awesome.
...their own investigation for elaborate cover-up is ridiculous. Crime scene investigation was in its infancy at the time.
Yeah.
As well as the Metropolitan Police. They were the world's first modern and professional police force, and yet they were only established in 1829. So quite naturally, a case like this, investigating the world's first modern serial killer, it was going to throw them through a bit of a loop. Anyway, let's wrap this up. What are my final impressions with From Hell? I think it lacks direction, it has cliched writing, it has little respect for the graphic novel, and especially not to the history they're both based on, which makes me wonder, if the source material is such a burden to your narrative, then why even bother adapting it in the first place?
Great point.
Whilst the Masonic royal family theory might be wrong, it's still possible to adapt it as a storyline and be respectful to the time period, which is why I would like to recommend instead that you watch the 1988 miniseries Jack the Ripper starring Michael Caine.
Who has a Cockney accent, so he's perfect for it.
Everything From Hell gets wrong, this gets right. It's a must-watch for every history buff. Well, that about wraps it up.
All right, that was good. I didn't agree with everything he said, but it like he said, it was a way to talk about this time period within the format that he uses. But if you really want to deep dive into this topic where I can really take some time to expand on it and do so using what I think is the best documentary on the murders I've ever seen, it's definitely my reaction to Lamino. So I'll put the link in the description to that. It will also be up here on the screen in just a second. Thanks for watching.